The dawn light struggled through ash-laden clouds, casting an unnatural gloom over the parched landscape of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory. The courthouse square, normally a place of mundane commerce, hummed with an uncomfortable tension that made even hardened frontiersmen shift in their boots. It was July 18, 1883, and the territorial orphan placement auction was about to begin, a grim necessity in a land where death came easy and mercy came hard. Jackson Hargrove stood at the edge of the growing crowd, his weathered hat pulled low over eyes that had seen too much for a man of 36. The dust of the trail still clung to his worn boots, and 3 days of stubble shadowed a face carved by sun and hardship. His calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold, just like his prospects. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hargrove Ranch had once been the pride of Yavapai County. 2,000 acres of promising grazing land that Jackson's father had claimed during the first wave of settlement after the war. For nearly 2 decades, it had supported 3 generations of Hargroves with cattle that thrived in the harsh but beautiful landscape. Now those same acres mocked Jackson with their emptiness, the herd reduced to less than 50 head after 3 seasons of drought and a cattle disease that swept through the territory like wildfire. The ranch house that once echoed with family voices now stood silent save for Jackson's solitary footsteps. His wife Caroline had succumbed to fever 4 years earlier, their infant daughter following her to the grave just days later. His younger brother Thomas, who should have been sharing the burden of the struggling ranch, lay buried in unmarked ground somewhere in the Dakota Territory, killed in a Sioux raid while scouting for the cavalry. The Hargrove name was meant to grow and flourish in this territory. Instead, it was fading like hoofprints in the dust. "Folks, if I could have your attention," called Judge Emmett Sullivan, a stern-faced man whose lined face spoke of 20 years dispensing frontier justice. His voice carried across the courthouse yard with practiced authority. "We'll commence with the placement proceedings for the territorial wards." The monthly auctions had become an unfortunate necessity in the Arizona Territory. Death came from many directions: Apache raids, mining accidents, disease outbreaks, and the countless other ways the frontier claimed those who dared to tame it. Children left without family became wards of the territory, and the system that placed them was both practical and heartbreaking in its efficiency. "We'll start with household goods and personal effects," Sullivan continued, "then move to placement." Of the miners, Jackson hadn't come for the auction. He'd ridden into town to speak with the bank about extending his loan, a conversation that had gone poorly. Banker Phillips had made it painfully clear that without substantial payment by the end of the month, foreclosure proceedings would begin. Jackson had exactly $17.43 to his name, not nearly enough to save the land his father had died defending against raiders. The early lots moved quickly: furniture, tools, personal effects, the worldly possessions of those who no longer needed them, sold to those who might give them purpose. Jackson watched with hollow eyes, seeing not the items changing hands but the stories they represented: dreams ended, futures altered, lives cut short. By noon, Judge Sullivan called for the final category. The mood of the gathering shifted. Noticeably, conversations dying away as people suddenly found interest in the dust at their feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sullivan announced, consulting his ledger, "today we have 9 children requiring placement. These are the Callahan children, orphaned 2 weeks ago when their parents and eldest brother perished in the Silver Peak mine collapse." A murmur rippled through the crowd. 9 children at once was unprecedented. Usually these proceedings involved 1 or 2 siblings, rarely more. 9 children represented a burden that few households, already struggling in the harsh territorial economy, could bear. "The children range in age from 16 down to 3 years, Sullivan continued. The territorial office would prefer to keep the siblings together, but understands that practical considerations may necessitate separate placements. Jackson found himself studying the children as they were led forward. They stood in a tight group, the older ones positioned protectively around the younger. Despite the dust of travel and the obvious signs of grief, they carried themselves with dignity. The eldest, a girl of about 16 with copper hair that caught the sunlight, surveyed the crowd with wary intelligence, her arm firmly around the shoulders of a small boy who couldn't have been more than 5. The Callahans had been known throughout the territory as decent, hard-working folk. Michael Callahan had been a skilled mining engineer. His wife Sarah, a respected midwife who had delivered half the children in 3 settlements. They hadn't been wealthy, but they'd been the kind of people others turned to in times of trouble. The Silver Peak disaster had claimed 17 lives, but the loss of the Callahans seemed to cut especially deep in the community. First we have Margaret Callahan, 16 years old, Judge Sullivan announced. Skilled in household management, basic nursing, and has been caring for her siblings since the tragedy. Starting bid of $2. The crowd's response was hesitant. A 16-year-old girl represented a valuable addition to a household. Old enough to work, young enough to train. But everyone understood Margaret came with unspoken expectations about her siblings. Mrs. Thornton, who ran the boarding house, offered $3. The Henderson family countered with 4. After brief bidding, Margaret was placed with the Wilsons, a childless couple who ran the general store and needed help with the business. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The older boys, twins named Robert and Richard, age 14, went next. Strong for their age and already knowledgeable about mining and basic mechanics, they were placed with the foreman of the Lucky Strike mine, who needed apprentices. 12-year-old Catherine, with her mother's skill for medicines and healing, was taken by Doc Ferguson's wife, who saw potential in the girl's inherited knowledge. But as the younger children came forward, the bidding grew increasingly reluctant. 10-year-old William and 8-year-old Elizabeth were placed with a farming family outside town who needed help with chores and could offer basic schooling in exchange. That left 3 children standing alone on the courthouse steps: 7-year-old Joseph, 5-year-old Samuel, and 3-year-old Anna. Their small faces showed the confusion and fear that the older children had managed to mask. Young Joseph stood protectively in front of his smaller siblings, his chin raised in a show of courage that squeezed something in Jackson's chest. Joseph Callahan, 7 years old, Judge Sullivan announced, his voice betraying a hint of concern. Healthy boy, good with animals according to his sister. Starting bid of $1. The silence stretched uncomfortably. A 7-year-old boy required years of feeding and clothing before he could contribute meaningful work to a household. In prosperous times, families might take in a young child out of kindness or Christian charity. But the territory was suffering. Through its 3rd year of hardship, and charity had become a luxury few could afford. 75 cents, Judge Sullivan tried again. Still nothing. Joseph's small shoulders stiffened, but he didn't cry. The judge looked increasingly uncomfortable. Samuel Callahan, 5 years old, he continued, though his voice had lost its official tone, and Anna Callahan, 3 years. The territorial office would prefer they be placed together. Starting bid of $1 for both children. The silence that followed was deafening. Jackson looked around at his neighbors and saw the same expression on every face, the painful recognition of a situation where the heart's desire conflicted with the harsh mathematics of survival. No one wanted to see children go unwanted, but taking in 2 young children meant years of expense with little return. Margaret Callahan, already standing with her new guardians, stepped forward again, her voice remarkably steady despite the tears shining in her eyes. "Please, they're good children. Anna barely makes a sound, and Samuel is clever with his letters already. Joseph can work. He helped our father with the animals and never complained once. Her plea hung in the air, but still no bids came. The uncomfortable silence stretched longer. Some people began to drift away, unable to bear witness to the spectacle of children being deemed too costly to save. Judge Sullivan cleared his throat. If there are no offers of placement, these children will be transported to the territorial orphanage in Prescott until suitable arrangements can be made. Jackson knew what that meant. The territorial orphanage was little more than a warehouse for unwanted children. Those who survived the disease that ran rampant through such places were often bound out as indentured servants when they reached suitable age, their education and welfare secondary to their labor value. Something shifted inside Jackson as he watched Joseph's arm go around his little brother's shoulders. The boy was trying so hard to be brave, to protect his siblings just as his older sister had done for him. It reminded Jackson painfully of his own brother Thomas, who had always shielded him from the worst of their father's temper, who had always put family above himself. $17. The words left Jackson's mouth before he'd made a conscious decision to speak. A ripple of shock passed through the remaining crowd. $17 was nearly a month's wages for a cowhand, an astronomical sum for children too young to work. Judge Sullivan blinked in surprise. "Mr. Hargrove, did you say $17? $17.43, Jackson clarified, his voice rough but determined. For all three children. The judge consulted his ledger, clearly confused by this unexpected development. "That's substantially above the usual placement compensation, Mr. Hargrove." "That's what I'm offering," Jackson replied, his hand already reaching for the money pouch that contained everything he had in the world. Money that was supposed to be a desperate attempt to hold off the bank for another month was now being offered. For three children who would only add to his financial burden. "The bid is $17.43, Sullivan announced, though his voice lacked conviction. Going once. The crowd had gone completely still, everyone staring at Jackson Hargrove as if he'd lost his mind. Perhaps he had. What was he thinking, taking on three young children when he could barely feed himself? When his ranch was weeks away from foreclosure? Going twice. Margaret Callahan was staring at him with an expression that mingled hope and suspicion, clearly wondering about the motives of this solitary rancher who was offering a fortune for her youngest siblings. Sold to Jackson Hargrove for $17.43. The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo across the square. Just like that, Jackson had spent his last hope of saving the ranch. Just like that, he had become responsible for three lives besides his own. The paperwork took longer than the bidding. Jackson signed documents that made him legally responsible for the welfare, education, and moral upbringing of Joseph, Samuel, and Anna Callahan. He barely registered the words on the pages, his mind still trying to catch up with the decision his heart had already made. Margaret Callahan approached him as he completed the forms, her eyes searching his face. "Mr. Hargrove, may I ask why? You paid so much for my brothers and sister?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. He could have given her platitudes about Christian charity or community responsibility, but something in her steady gaze demanded honesty. "I'm not entirely sure myself," he admitted. "I just couldn't stand watching them being valued in pennies when they're worth so much more." Something in his answer seemed to satisfy her. "They're good children, Mr. Hargrove. Our mother raised us to work hard and tell the truth. Joseph already knows how to feed chickens and collect eggs. Samuel can help with small chores. Anna," her voice faltered slightly, "Anna still asks for our mother at night." Jackson nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I won't pretend. I know much about raising children, Miss Callahan. My wife and daughter died years ago. But I promise you this, they'll be safe with me and they'll know they're wanted." Will we be able to see them? She asked, the question revealing her greatest fear. Of course, Jackson replied without hesitation. You're their sister. That doesn't change because some judge banged a gavel. The ranch is only 5 miles outside town. You and your brothers are welcome any time. Relief softened the tension in Margaret's face. Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. That means more than I can say. As Jackson turned to collect his new wards, he came face to face with Banker Phillips, whose expression mingled disbelief and disapproval. Hargrove, have you taken leave of your senses? Phillips asked in a low voice. You just spent every cent you had on 3 mouths you can't afford to feed. What about the loan payment? Jackson met the banker's gaze steadily. I'll figure something out. You're already on the brink of losing everything, Phillips pressed. This act of, whatever this is, just sealed your fate. The bank won't extend any further credit. I didn't expect you would, Jackson replied, surprising himself with his calm. But some things matter more than land or money, Phillips. These children needed someone to stand for them. Today, that someone was me. Leaving the banker speechless, Jackson approached the 3 Callahan children who now stood alone, their small faces showing the wary hope of those who had learned that fate could turn cruel in an instant. He crouched down to their level, his knees protesting the position. Hello there. My name is Jackson Hargrove. I have a ranch outside town, and it seems like you 3 will be coming home with me. Joseph studied him with solemn eyes that had aged decades in the past 2 weeks. Are you our new pa now? The question hit Jackson like a physical blow. He hadn't thought beyond the immediate crisis, hadn't considered what these children would call him or how they would understand their relationship. I don't know about that, he said honestly. For now, how about you just call me Jackson, and we'll figure the rest out as we go along. Samuel, apparently deciding that honesty deserved honesty in return, asked bluntly, Do you have any cows? Despite everything, Jackson found himself smiling for the first time in what felt like years. I do have cows. Not as many as I used to, but enough. And chickens too, though they're an ornery bunch. I'm good with chickens, Joseph offered cautiously. Our pa used to let me gather eggs every morning. Then it sounds like you'll be a big help, Jackson replied, careful to acknowledge the boy's former father while offering him place in this new arrangement. Little Anna, who had been hiding behind her brothers, suddenly stepped forward and slipped her tiny hand into Jackson's much larger one. She didn't speak, but the gesture of trust nearly undid him. The ride back to the ranch passed in relative silence. The children sat huddled together in the wagon bed, taking in their surroundings with the intense focus of those mapping escape routes or memorizing the path home. Jackson found himself seeing his property through their eyes and feeling ashamed of what they must be seeing. The Hargrove Ranch had once been a showplace with well-maintained buildings and prosperous herds. Now the main house needed paint and repairs. The corrals were missing rails, and the barn roof had patched sections that wouldn't hold through another rainy season. The pastures that should have been filled with cattle were mostly empty, and those few animals that remained looked thin despite the spring grass. As they approached the house, Samuel suddenly pointed toward the distant mountains. Look, Joseph. You can see forever from here. His brother followed his gaze, and for the first time, Jackson saw the boy's face lighten. It's bigger than the whole town. Wait until you see the sunset, Jackson found himself saying. The whole sky turns colors you wouldn't believe. By the time they reached the house, the children's initial wariness had begun to give way to the natural curiosity of youth. Joseph was asking questions about the cattle. Samuel was pointing out every jackrabbit and ground squirrel they passed. And even little Anna had begun to look around with interest rather than fear. As they climbed down from the wagon, Jackson realized that his life had changed in ways he couldn't begin to anticipate. 6 hours ago, he had been a solitary man facing the probable loss of everything his family had built. Now he was responsible for 3 children who needed not just food and shelter, but the kind of guidance and care that would shape who they became. He had acted on instinct, moved by compassion and memories of his own family without any clear plan for how to manage the practical challenges that lay ahead. But looking at Joseph, Samuel, and Anna Callahan as they stood in front of the ranch house, their small faces showing tentative hope where there had been only fear before, Jackson felt something shift in his understanding of what his life might mean. The sun was beginning to sink behind the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of gold and crimson just as he had promised. For the first time in years, Jackson Hargrove wasn't watching it alone. The first morning at the Hargrove ranch began well before dawn, with Jackson startled awake by a small hand tugging urgently at his sleeve. He opened his eyes to find Samuel standing beside his bed, eyes wide with concern. "Mr. Jackson, Anna's crying and we can't make her stop," the 5-year-old reported with the somber responsibility of a child who had been forced to become a caretaker. Far too soon. Jackson followed Samuel to the small bedroom he had hastily prepared for the children the night before. They had arrived too late to do more than make up pallets on the floor, using spare blankets and quilts that had been stored away since Caroline's death. He'd promised proper beds would come soon, once he got things sorted, a phrase that had felt hollow even as he said it. Anna sat huddled in the corner, tears streaming silently down her face, while Joseph knelt beside her, awkwardly patting her shoulder. The boy looked up as Jackson entered, his expression both defensive and pleading. "She wants our mama," Joseph explained, his voice catching. "I told her mama can't come, but she doesn't understand." Jackson's heart clenched. What did he know about comforting a 3-year-old? His own daughter had died before she'd even learned to smile. He knelt down beside Anna, feeling clumsy and oversized next to her tiny form. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "Can't sleep, huh?" Anna stared at him with tear-filled eyes but didn't answer. Jackson noticed she was clutching something tightly in her small hand, a tattered hair ribbon that must have belonged to her mother. "You know," he said, settling himself more comfortably on the floor, "when I was a boy not much older than Joseph here, I used to get scared at night too. My May taught me that when you're afraid, the best thing to do is count the stars until you fall asleep." Anna's crying slowed as she listened to his voice, though her expression remained solemn. "Would you like to try that? We could look at the stars together." He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Anna placed her tiny palm in his. Jackson carefully lifted her, surprised at how little she weighed, and carried her to the window. Joseph and Samuel followed, unwilling to be separated from their sister. Outside, the Arizona night was alive with stars, brilliant points of light, scattered across the velvet darkness in patterns that had guided travelers since time immemorial. "See there?" Jackson pointed. "That bright one is the North Star. It always stays in the same place, so if you ever get lost, you can find your way home by looking for it. Our pa showed us that one," Joseph said quietly. "He knew all the stars. Is he up there now?" Samuel asked, voicing the question with childish directness. "Ma said people become stars when they die." Jackson felt wholly unprepared for such theological territory. His own faith had been severely tested by Caroline's death, and he had no easy answers about the afterlife to offer these children. "I don't know exactly," he said finally, deciding that honesty was better than platitudes. "But I like to think the people we love can still see us somehow, even when they're gone." Anna reached up toward the star-filled sky, her tears forgotten for the moment. "Mama," she said clearly, the first word Jackson had heard her speak. They stood together at the window, counting stars until Anna's eyelids began to droop. Jackson carried her back to her pallet and tucked the blanket around her small form. To his surprise, she didn't let go of his hand, and he found himself sitting beside her, humming an old lullaby his mother had sung to him until she drifted off to sleep. By the time the first hint of dawn colored the eastern sky, Jackson was already in the kitchen, staring at the meager contents of his pantry and realizing that feeding 3 growing children required a completely different approach than sustaining himself on coffee and whatever game he could shoot when supplies ran low. His contemplation was interrupted by Joseph, who appeared in the doorway fully dressed, his hair weightily slicked down as if he'd dunked his head in the wash basin. "I can help with chores, Mr. Jackson," the boy said, his voice carrying the earnest desire to be useful that broke Jackson's heart. 7 years old and already so desperate to prove his worth. "I'd welcome the company," Jackson replied, making an effort to sound casual. "Do you think your brother and sister will be hungry when they wake up?" Joseph nodded seriously. "Samuel's always hungry. Anna might not eat much at first. She's shy with new people." The simple insights into his siblings' personalities revealed how closely Joseph had been observing and caring for them. Jackson made a mental note to be sure the boy had time to just be a child, not always carrying the weight of responsibility for the younger ones. "Well, let's see what we can rustle up," Jackson said, turning back to the pantry. "I've got flour and some bacon. Could probably manage flapjacks if you're willing to help." "Our ma made flapjacks on Sundays," Joseph offered, coming to stand beside him. "She let me stir the batter sometimes." Together, they assembled a breakfast that was simple but filling. By the time Samuel and Anna wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of cooking food, Jackson and Joseph had set the table with mismatched plates that hadn't been used since Caroline was alive. Samuel's eyes widened at the sight of the flapjacks. "Are those all for us?" "For all of us," Jackson corrected gently, pulling out a chair for Anna and lifting her onto it. "There's plenty, so eat your fill." The meal that followed was the first time Jackson had shared his table with anyone in years. The children ate hungrily, but with the careful manners that spoke to their upbringing. Even little Anna managed her food without assistance, though she remained largely silent, watching Jackson with solemn eyes. After breakfast, the real work of the day began. Jackson hadn't planned on taking the children with him for chores, but Joseph insisted he could help, and Samuel refused to be left behind. Anna, still unwilling to be separated from her brothers, followed along silently, her small hand firmly gripping Samuel's. Jackson quickly discovered that Joseph hadn't been exaggerating about his skills with animals. The boy approached the chickens with quiet confidence, speaking to them in low tones as he collected eggs without disturbing the hens. Samuel proved to have a knack for spotting things others missed: a loose board in the chicken coop, a place where the garden fence was starting to sag. By mid-morning, they had established a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Jackson found himself explaining ranch operations to eager listeners, answering endless questions from Samuel, and demonstrating tasks for Joseph. Even Anna began to engage, pointing at animals and objects with curious interest. When they broke for a midday meal, Jackson was struck by how different the ranch felt with these small presences animating spaces that had been silent for too long. The rooms that had echoed with emptiness now rang with children's voices. The work that had seemed pointless when done alone now had purpose when shared with young helpers, who took pride in each small accomplishment. But as the day progressed, the practical challenges of their situation became increasingly apparent. The children had arrived with only the clothes they wore and a few personal belongings. They would need proper beds, additional clothing, school supplies, and countless other necessities that Jackson had no means to provide. More pressing was the fact that he had spent his last dollar, literally, on securing their placement. The bank payment was now impossible to make, which meant foreclosure was imminent. Within a month, they might all be homeless. As the children settled in for the night, exhausted from the day's activities but more relaxed than they had been upon arrival, Jackson sat at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, trying to devise some strategy that could save them all from Disaster. The numbers were unforgiving. Even with the most optimistic projections for cattle sales, he couldn't generate enough income to satisfy the bank. The logical solution was obvious but unthinkable. He could return the children to the territorial office, explain that his financial situation made adequate care impossible, and hope they would refund at least part of his payment. The very thought made him physically ill. These children had already lost everything: their parents, their home, their siblings. They were just beginning to show signs of trust, to believe that they might have found stability again. Returning them would be another betrayal, more evidence that the world was unreliable and that adults couldn't be trusted to keep their promises. No, he decided, pushing the paper away. Whatever happened, the children would stay with him. He would find another way, even if it meant losing the ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations. The solution, when it came, wasn't a grand revelation, but a series of small decisions and unexpected developments that began the very next day. It started with a visit from Margaret Callahan, who arrived at the ranch mid-morning with a bundle of children's clothing and a determined expression. Her new guardians, the Wilsons, had given her the afternoon off to check on her siblings, and she had spent the morning collecting donations from various townspeople who had known her family. "People want to help," she explained as she unpacked neatly folded shirts and trousers that would fit the boys. The Callahans helped a lot of folks over the years. Mrs. Henderson sent these dresses for Anna. They belonged to her granddaughter before they moved to California. Jackson was both touched and uncomfortable with the charity, his pride warring with practical necessity. Margaret seemed to sense his discomfort. "It's not charity, Mr. Hargrove," she said firmly. "It's community. When the Jenkins place burned down last year, our parents were the first to offer shelter and supplies. That's how things work out here. We help each other through the hard times." Her words struck a chord. Jackson had been so focused on his own struggles, so determined to handle everything alone, that he'd forgotten what it meant to be part of a community. His isolation after Caroline's death had been self-imposed, a retreat from a world that seemed to have no place for his grief. That evening, as Jackson sat on the porch watching the sunset with 3 children who now depended on him, he made a decision that went against everything his pride had been telling him for years. He would ask for help, not as charity, but as one member of a community reaching out to others. The next day, he rode into town with the children and sought out Tom Bennett, whose blacksmith shop had been a gathering place for local men for as long as Jackson could remember. Bennett had been a friend of Jackson's father, and though they hadn't spoken much in recent years, the older man greeted him with genuine warmth. "These must be the Callahan young'uns I've been hearing about," Bennett said, his voice gentler than his imposing frame would suggest. "Quite a responsibility you've taken on, Jackson." "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about," Jackson replied, then hesitated, finding it harder than expected to form the words. Finally, he pushed ahead. "I need work, Tom, paid work. The ranch isn't producing enough, and I've got these 3 to provide for now." Bennett studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Never thought I'd see the day a Hargrove asked for employment instead of offering it," he said finally. Jackson's face heated, but before he could respond, Bennett continued, "About time, if you ask me. Too much pride isn't good for a man. As it happens, I could use some help around the shop. My joints aren't what they used to be, and there's more work than I can handle alone." The offer was presented as a business arrangement rather than charity, allowing Jackson to accept without losing face. They agreed on terms that were fair to both, with the additional understanding that Joseph and the younger children could stay at the shop when necessary. Bennett wasn't the only one who proved willing to help. Once word spread that Jackson Hargrove was actively seeking solutions rather than stubbornly facing ruin alone, other opportunities emerged. Mrs. Wilson, who had taken in Margaret, offered to watch Anna during the days when Jackson was working. Reverend Carpenter arranged for Samuel to join the small school he ran for local children. Most significantly, 3 other ranchers from the area approached Jackson with a proposition. They had all been struggling with the same drought conditions and economic pressures, but separately, none of them had enough cattle or resources to make significant improvements. Together, however, they might be able to implement changes that could benefit them all. "We've been watching that new breeding stock from back east," explained Bill Murray, whose ranch bordered the Hargrove property. "Could improve our herds substantially, but none of us can afford it alone. If we pooled our resources, though." The cooperative arrangement they proposed wasn't charity. It was practical business sense that offered mutual benefit. Jackson would contribute his land and knowledge, while the others would bring capital and labor. Together they had a chance to build something that could weather the boom and bust cycles that had broken so many ranchers in the territory. When Jackson presented the proposal to banker Phillips, the man was skeptical but intrigued. The bank had no desire to foreclose on a property they would struggle to sell in the current market. A viable business plan that could eventually result in loan repayment was preferable to seizing land that might sit empty for years. "I'm not making any promises, Hargrove," Phillips said after reviewing the numbers. "But if you can get these other ranchers to sign on formally, the bank might be willing to restructure your loan under the new arrangement." By the end of August, just 6 weeks after the courthouse auction that had changed everything, Jackson's life had transformed in ways he never could have anticipated. He was working 3 days a week at Bennett's blacksmith shop, learning a trade that provided immediate income. The other days were spent implementing the cooperative ranching plan that had given the bank enough confidence to postpone foreclosure. The Hargrove Ranch was no longer a solitary operation, but part of a community effort that had potential beyond anything Jackson could have achieved alone. More importantly, the children were thriving in ways that seemed miraculous given all they had endured. Joseph had become Jackson's shadow, absorbing knowledge about ranching, blacksmithing, and the natural world with an intelligence that reminded Jackson of his brother Thomas. The boy still carried more responsibility than a 7-year-old should bear, but he was learning to trust that adults would handle the bigger problems. Samuel had taken to school with unexpected enthusiasm, his natural curiosity finding outlet in books and learning. Reverend Carpenter reported that the boy had a gift for numbers that might one day lead to opportunities beyond ranching. Even Anna had begun to emerge from her shell of silence. She still rarely spoke, but she had developed a form of communication through gestures and expressions that Jackson was learning to interpret with increasing accuracy. Most encouraging was the sound of her laughter, which he heard for the first time when Samuel chased a chicken around the yard in a failed attempt to help Joseph gather eggs. The practical challenges remained substantial. Money was tight, the future uncertain, and the grief that had brought them together still surfaced in unexpected moments. Anna's nighttime tears, Joseph's sudden withdrawals into silence, Samuel's questions about where people go when they die. But as September arrived and the first hint of autumn touched the desert landscape, Jackson realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what constituted wealth and poverty. The ranch that had seemed like his only legacy, the land he had been so desperate to save, was just dirt and grass without people to give it meaning. True inheritance, he was beginning to understand, wasn't measured in acres or cattle, but in the connections between people who chose to care for each other. The Callahan children had lost their birth parents, but they were gaining a network of adults who were committed to their welfare. Margaret's guardians, Reverend Carpenter, Mrs. Wilson, Tom Bennett, and others who had stepped forward to offer various forms of support. At the center of this expanding circle stood Jackson himself, a man who had been drowning in isolation until 3 orphan children had given him reason to reach out instead of turning inward. He had spent his last dollar buying their placement, but what they had given him in return was beyond price. One evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars appear, Joseph asked the question that had been forming in Jackson's mind as, "Well, Mr. Jackson," the boy said, his voice carrying the careful consideration of someone trying to find exactly the right words, "are we staying here for good now? Or is this just until someone else takes us?" Jackson looked at the three children who had become the center of his world in just 2 months. Joseph with his solemn responsibility, Samuel with his boundless curiosity, and Anna with her watchful silence that was slowly giving way to trust. "You're staying for good," he said firmly. "This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. Even when we cause trouble?" Samuel asked, the question revealing a fear that had been lurking beneath his usual cheerfulness. "Even then," Jackson assured him. "Families stick together through good times and bad." "Are we a family now?" Joseph asked, the hope in his voice barely contained. Jackson thought about all the definitions of family he had known, the one he was born into, the one he had tried to create with Carolyn, and now this unexpected combination of wounded souls trying to heal together. "Yes," he said simply, "we're a family now." The words settled over them like a blessing as the stars continued to appear in the vast Arizona sky, each one a point of light in the darkness, together forming patterns that had guided travelers home since the beginning of time. Artifact_create. I've created the first part of your story titled, "Desperate Rancher Bought 9 Orphans at Courthouse Steps. What he built next shocked the territory." The script follows the storytelling structure we discussed with a compelling hook, introduction of the main character, Jackson Hargrove, and the initial crisis that leads him to purchase 3 orphaned Callahan children with his last $17.43, the first true test of Jackson Hargrove's commitment to his newfound family came in November 1883, when an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch just as winter's first chill settled over the territory. Jackson was mending fence with Joseph's help when they spotted the dust trail of an approaching rider. "Who could that be?" Joseph asked, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. "Not sure," Jackson replied, though a sense of unease had already begun to form in his gut. Few people came this far out unless they had specific business. The rider turned out to be Curtis Adams, a territorial official whose crisp suit and polished boots looked absurdly out of place against the rugged landscape. Adams introduced himself with the practiced formality of a man accustomed to wielding authority through paperwork rather than physical presence. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm here regarding the Callahan children," Adams announced after dismounting. "There have been concerns raised about their placement." Jackson felt Joseph press against his side, the boy's body suddenly tense with fear. "What kind of concerns?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. Adams consulted a leather portfolio with officious precision. "Complaints have been filed suggesting that a single man of limited means cannot provide adequate care, education, and moral guidance for 3 young children. The territorial office takes such matters very seriously." "Who filed these complaints?" Jackson demanded, though he could guess. Banker Phillips had made no secret of his disapproval, and there were others in town who viewed Jackson's unconventional family with suspicion. "That information is confidential," Adams replied smoothly. "I'm here to conduct an assessment of the children's living conditions and welfare. Depending on my findings, adjustments to their placement may be necessary." The bureaucratic language couldn't disguise the threat. This man had the authority to take the children away if he deemed Jackson's care inadequate. "You're welcome to look around," Jackson said, fighting to keep his voice level. "The children are well cared for." As they walked toward the house, Samuel spotted them and came running across the yard, his face alight with the excitement of a 5-year-old. "With news to share, Mr. Jackson, I wrote my whole name today. All by myself." Jackson felt a surge of pride mingled with fear. These past months had been filled with small victories like this, Anna speaking her first full sentence, Joseph mastering a difficult ranch skill, Samuel learning his letters. Each achievement had been celebrated as evidence that the children were healing, thriving despite all they had endured. Now a stranger would judge whether those accomplishments meant anything against the stark reality of their modest circumstances. Adam spent the afternoon conducting what he called a thorough evaluation. He measured rooms, inspected food supplies, questioned Jackson about educational arrangements and financial resources. He interviewed each child separately, his questions designed to reveal any problems or deficiencies in their care. By the time he finished, the sun was setting, and Jackson's nerves were stretched to breaking point. The children sensed his tension, staying unnaturally quiet as they waited for the official to deliver his judgment. "Mr. Hargrove," Adam said finally, his tone revealing nothing, "based on my assessment, there are several areas of concern regarding this placement." Jackson felt something cold settle in his chest. Beside him, Joseph stood rigidly, his small hand finding Jackson's larger one and gripping it with desperate strength. "The sleeping arrangements are cramped. Your financial situation remains precarious despite recent improvements, and there is no female influence to provide proper guidance for the young girl." Adams continued, ticking off points on his fingers. "Furthermore, while Reverend Carpenter speaks highly of Samuel's progress, the educational provisions for all 3 children fall below territorial standards." "We're making improvements every day," Jackson argued, hearing the desperation in his own voice. "The children are healthy, they're learning, they're recovering from losing their parents. Surely that counts for something." Adams's expression remained impassive. "I'll be submitting my report to the territorial office with a recommendation that alternative placements be considered, particularly for the younger children." The words fell like hammer blows. Jackson had known from the beginning that their situation was precarious, but he'd convinced himself that love and commitment could compensate for material deficiencies. Now a government official was telling him that his best wasn't good enough, that the family they were building together might be torn apart by the same system that had brought them together. Before Jackson could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the conversation. To his astonishment, a group of riders was coming up the road to the ranch: Tom Bennett, Bill Murray, and the other ranchers from the cooperative, Reverend Carpenter, and most surprisingly, Margaret Callahan riding double with Mrs. Wilson. "Looks like you've got company," Adams observed, clearly confused by the sudden arrival of so many people. The riders dismounted, and Margaret immediately went to her siblings, gathering all 3 into a fierce embrace. The others approached Jackson and Adams with purposeful strides. "Mr. Adams," Tom Bennett said, his deep voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived in the territory for decades, "we understand you're here about the Callahan children." Adams looked startled. "This is an official territorial matter. I'm not sure what business it is of yours." "Everything that happens in this community is our business," Mrs. Wilson replied firmly, "especially when it concerns children who are part of our extended family." "Family?" Adams repeated skeptically. "These children were placed through the territorial office. Mr. Hargrove has legal custody." "But nothing," Bennett interrupted. "Jackson Hargrove isn't raising these children alone. We're all raising them together." One by one, the visitors stepped forward to address Adams's areas of concern. Reverend Carpenter produced detailed records of Samuel's educational progress and outlined plans for Joseph to join the school once winter passed. Mrs. Wilson explained the arrangement whereby Anna spent 3 days each week in her home, receiving the female influence Adams had found lacking. Bill Murray and the other ranchers detailed the cooperative venture that had stabilized Jackson's financial situation. "The bank has restructured his loan based on our joint business plan," Murray explained. "Foreclosure is no longer a threat." Most powerful was Margaret Callahan's testimony. At 17, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had shouldered adult responsibilities far too early. But her voice was clear and confident as she addressed the territorial official. "Mr. Adams, I've been watching how my brothers and sisters are cared for since they came to live with Mr. Hargrove. They're healthier, happier, and more secure than they were in the territorial facility after our parents died. Jackson Hargrove spent everything he had to keep them together when no one else would take all three. He's learned to be the parent they need, and they're healing because of his care and the support of this community." Adams seemed overwhelmed by this unexpected resistance. He had come expecting to find a struggling bachelor failing at childcare. Instead, he had encountered an organized community determined to support one of its own. "The territorial office's primary concern is the welfare of the children," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "As is ours," Reverend Carpenter replied. "That's why we're all here. These children have suffered enough loss. Taking them from a home where they're loved and supported would cause unnecessary trauma when they're finally beginning to heal." The confrontation might have continued, but at that moment, little Anna Callahan slipped away from her sister and walked directly to Adams, the 3-year-old who had barely spoken. When she first arrived at the ranch, looked up at the official with solemn eyes. "This is my home," she said clearly, her small voice carrying the absolute conviction that only children can manage. "Jackson is our family now." The simple declaration accomplished what all the adult arguments might not have. Adams looked down at the child, then around at the circle of community members who had rallied to protect her family, and something in his official demeanor softened. "I'll need to include all this information in my report," he said finally. "The community support network, the educational arrangements, the financial improvements. It presents a very different picture than what was conveyed in the initial complaints. It wasn't a promise that the children could stay, but it was an acknowledgement that the situation was more complex than he had initially believed." As Adams prepared to leave, having taken extensive notes about the community's involvement, he paused to speak privately with Jackson. "Mr. Hargrove, I've seen many children placed in homes throughout the territory. Some thrive, some merely survive, and some suffer terribly despite our best efforts to protect them. I came here expecting to find children at risk. Instead, I found something quite remarkable." "What's that?" Jackson asked, still wary despite the official's changed tone. "A family being born from loss," Adams replied, "and a community that understands what that's worth protecting." He mounted his horse, touched his hat in a gesture of respect that would have been unthinkable hours earlier, and rode away. The gathering that followed was part celebration, part council of war. No one believed that Adams's report would end the challenges they faced. There would be more inspections, more questions, more hurdles to overcome before the children's place with Jackson would be secure. "We need to be strategic," Reverend Carpenter advised as they sat around Jackson's kitchen table that evening. "The territorial office respects documentation. We should maintain detailed records of the children's health, education, and development. And we need to formalize these support arrangements," Mrs. Wilson added. "Letters from each of us describing our involvement with the children's care will carry weight with officials." As the adults discussed practical matters, Jackson found himself watching the children. Margaret sat with her siblings in the corner of the room, their heads closed together, as they shared whispered conversations punctuated by occasional laughter. Despite being separated by placement, they remained bound by the unbreakable ties of shared history and love. Seeing them together, Jackson realized that his responsibility extended beyond the 3 children under his roof. He needed to ensure that all the Callahan siblings maintained their connections, that the family bond survived despite the fragmentation forced upon them by circumstance. The meeting continued late into the night, plans taking shape that went far beyond simply defending Jackson's right to raise Joseph, Samuel, and Anna. What emerged was a vision of community, responsibility for all children who had lost their parents or found themselves at risk. There are dozens of orphan children throughout the territory, Reverend Carpenter noted. Many end up in situations far worse than what these children faced. If we can develop a model that works, that proves community-based care is better than institutional placement. The implications were profound. What had begun as one man's impulsive act of compassion might become something that changed how the entire territory approached child welfare. By the time the visitors departed, promising to return soon with further plans and preparations, Jackson felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the peculiar combination of exhaustion and exhilaration that comes from being part of something larger than oneself, something with purpose that extends beyond individual concerns. The children were already asleep, worn out by the emotional intensity of the day. Jackson checked on them before turning in himself, their peaceful faces in the lamplight stirring protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed before they came into his life. In the quiet darkness of his own room, Jackson reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few months. Before the auction, he'd been a man trapped in grief and isolation, stubbornly facing ruin rather than asking for help or considering new possibilities. Now he found himself at the center of a community effort that might transform not just his own future, but the lives of vulnerable children throughout the territory. The irony wasn't lost on him. By spending his last dollar to save 3 orphan children, he had saved himself from a lonely defeat that would have destroyed everything his family had built. By opening his home to Joseph, Samuel, and Anna, he had opened doors to possibilities he never would have considered while fighting his battles alone. The months that followed Adams's visit brought both challenges and unexpected developments. True to his word, the territorial official submitted a report that acknowledged the community support network while still highlighting areas that needed improvement. This led to a conditional approval of the placement, with regular inspections scheduled to monitor progress. Far from resenting this oversight, Jackson and his allies used it as motivation to strengthen their approach. The improvements they made to accommodate the children's needs became the foundation for something much larger than any of them had initially envisioned. The first major development came in January 1884, when Reverend Carpenter approached Jackson with a proposition that seemed both wildly ambitious and oddly inevitable given the path they had been traveling. "The church owns that parcel adjacent to your eastern boundary," the Reverend explained, spreading a map across Jackson's kitchen table. "It was donated years ago, but we've never had the resources to develop it. What if we combined it with a portion of your land to create something new? A place that could serve children throughout the region who need homes and education?" The idea took root and grew rapidly. The cooperative ranching venture had proven that combining resources could create opportunities beyond what any individual could achieve alone. Applying that same principle to the challenge of caring for orphaned and vulnerable children seemed like a natural extension. By spring, plans had been drawn for what they were calling the Callahan Home and School, a tribute to the family whose tragedy had sparked this community response. The design called for dormitory buildings that could house up to 20 children, a schoolhouse, workshops for practical training, and agricultural facilities where the children could learn ranching and farming skills. The scope of the project would have been intimidating if attempted by one person, but divided among many hands, it became manageable. Tom Bennett organized construction crews composed of volunteers from 3 settlements, Mrs. Wilson and other women from town developed plans for the school curriculum and daily operations. The ranchers from the cooperative contributed livestock and equipment. Most remarkable was the territorial government's response. When Adams returned for his scheduled inspection in March, he brought news that transformed their grassroots effort into something with official sanction. "The territorial governor has been following your progress with interest," Adams explained, his former bureaucratic stiffness replaced by genuine enthusiasm. "There's federal funding available for innovative approaches to education and child Welfare in Frontier Regions. If you're willing to document your methods and results, this project could become a model for similar efforts throughout the Western Territories. The prospect of government support accelerated their timeline dramatically. By summer, construction was underway on the first buildings of what would eventually become a campus spanning hundreds of acres. The cornerstone of the main building was laid in a ceremony that brought together people from settlements across the county, many contributing labor, materials, or funds to the effort. Throughout this whirlwind of activity, Jackson remained focused on the 3 children who had started it all. Joseph had begun formal schooling with Reverend Carpenter, his natural intelligence blossoming with education. Samuel's energy found constructive outlets in the daily activities of ranch life, his curiosity driving him to learn everything from carpentry to astronomy. Anna, now 4, was talking freely, her earlier silence replaced by a stream of questions and observations that revealed a bright, perceptive mind. They still had difficult moments, nightmares that woke the household, sudden withdrawals into silence when grief resurfaced, questions about their parents that Jackson couldn't fully answer. But those episodes became less frequent as security and routine helped heal the deepest wounds of loss. The most significant development in their family life came in August 1884, almost exactly a year after Jackson had bid for the children at the Courthouse auction. Margaret Callahan, now 18 and legally an adult, approached Jackson with a request that he hadn't anticipated, but immediately recognized as right. "I've been offered a position as assistant teacher at Reverend Carpenter's school," she explained. "And Mrs. Wilson has agreed to rent me this small room behind their store. But what I really want—" She hesitated, then continued with determination. "What I really want is to be closer to my brothers and sister, to be part of what you're building here." The request was simple but profound. Margaret wasn't asking just for employment or housing, but for inclusion in the family that had formed around her siblings. Despite the legal separations imposed by the auction system, the Callahan children remained bound by ties that bureaucracy couldn't sever. "This has always been as much your home as theirs," Jackson replied without hesitation. "You belonged here from the beginning." Margaret's integration into their household brought a balance that had been missing. Jackson had done his best as a surrogate father, but there were aspects of the children's care where Margaret's feminine perspective and familial connection added dimensions he couldn't provide. More importantly, her presence strengthened the children's sense of continuity with their past. She carried memories of their parents that the younger ones might otherwise have lost, stories and family traditions that preserved their heritage. By autumn, their expanded family had established a rhythm that felt both natural and extraordinary given how they had come together. Jackson continued his work with the blacksmith shop and the ranching cooperative, while Margaret divided her time between teaching and caring for her siblings. The younger children thrived under this arrangement, secure in the knowledge that they had not just one but 2 adults who were completely committed to their welfare. The construction of the Callahan home and school continued through the winter, with the first buildings completed by early 1885. As spring approached, they prepared to welcome the first group of children beyond the Callahan siblings, 5 orphans from a mining settlement 50 miles away where an influenza outbreak had left them without parents or close relatives. The evening before these new children were scheduled to arrive, Jackson found himself on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset with Joseph beside him. The boy, now 9, had grown inches in the past year and had begun to lose the waif-like appearance of the child at the auction. His face had filled out, his eyes held confidence instead of fear, and his voice had lost the careful hesitation that had marked his early days at the ranch. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Jackson asked, knowing that the arrival of new children would change the dynamics of their household. Joseph considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "A little," he admitted, "but mostly I'm glad. They need somewhere to belong, like we did." "That's a generous way to think about it," Jackson said, proud of the empathy the boy was developing. "That's what you did for us," Joseph replied simply. "You gave us somewhere to belong when nobody else would." The observation caught Jackson off guard with its accuracy. When he had bid for the Callahan children, he had acted from instinct rather than any clear plan. He couldn't have imagined the journey that decision would initiate, the community it would mobilize, or the institution it would ultimately create. "You know," he said after a moment, "I think we found where we all belonged, together." Joseph nodded, his eyes on the brilliant colors painting the western sky. "Do you think other people will understand? About making families that don't start the usual way?" It was a profound question from a child who had experienced both the fragility and the resilience of family bonds. Jackson thought about the network of relationships that had formed around them, Margaret returning to help raise her siblings, the community members who had become extended family, the partnership with territorial officials that was expanding their vision beyond one ranch or one group of children. "Some will understand right away," he replied. "Others might take time. But we'll show them what's possible when people choose to care for each other, even when it's difficult. Sometimes the most important things we build aren't barns or houses, or even schools. They're families," Joseph finished for him. Exactly. As darkness fell and stars appeared in the vast Arizona sky, Jackson thought about the journey ahead. Tomorrow would bring new children, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate that family could be created through choice and commitment, rather than just biology or legal obligation. The Callahan home and school would eventually serve hundreds of children, becoming a model for similar institutions throughout the Western territories. None of that would have happened if he hadn't spent his last dollar on 3 children no one else wanted. That impulsive act of compassion had set in motion changes that would ripple outward for generations, touching lives he would never know and creating possibilities that extended far beyond his own lifetime. The legacy he was building wasn't measured in acres or cattle or even buildings, but in the resilience of children who found hope after loss, in the community that came together to support its most vulnerable members, and in the redefinition of family that accommodated the complex realities of frontier life. As Joseph headed inside to join his siblings for the evening routine that had become sacred in its ordinary comfort, Jackson remained on the porch a moment longer, offering silent gratitude to whatever fate or providence had led him to that courthouse auction a year earlier. He had gone there a desperate man seeking financial salvation and had instead found something far more valuable, the chance to create family from the fragments of broken dreams, to build belonging where there had been only loss. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, under a canopy of stars that had guided travelers home since time immemorial, Jackson Hargrove knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was born to do. By the spring of 1890, the Callahan home and school had become a landmark known throughout the Arizona territory and beyond. What had begun as a desperate bid at a courthouse auction had blossomed into an institution that was transforming how the entire western frontier approached the care of orphaned and vulnerable children. The original buildings had been joined by a complex of structures that spread across the combined properties of the Hargrove Ranch and the adjacent church land. Dormitories housed 32 children of various ages, while classrooms, workshops, barns, and agricultural fields provided both education and practical training. The once struggling cattle operation had been supplemented by innovative farming methods that made the institution largely self-sufficient in food production. Most importantly, the vision that had begun with 3 orphan siblings had expanded to encompass a philosophy of care that challenged prevailing wisdom about child welfare. Unlike the regimented orphanages that treated children as burdens to be managed until they could be bound out for labor, the Callahan home embraced a family model that recognized each child's inherent worth and potential. Jackson Hargrove now 43 with silver threading through his dark hair, stood on the hill overlooking the complex, marveling at what 7 years of determined effort had created. Beside him stood Joseph Callahan, 16 now and nearly as tall as Jackson himself. The boy who had once stood trembling on the courthouse steps had grown into a young man whose quiet intelligence and natural leadership had made him an essential part of the home's operations. "Hard to believe it all started with just us," Joseph remarked, echoing Jackson's thoughts. "Sometimes the smallest decisions change everything," Jackson replied. "If I hadn't been at that auction that day." He let the thought trail off, unwilling to imagine the alternative paths their lives might have taken. Joseph and his siblings might have been separated permanently, lost in a system that valued their labor more than their humanity. Jackson himself might have lost the ranch, becoming another displaced casualty of the boom and bust cycles that broke so many frontier dreams. Instead, they had built something that had not only saved them, but was now saving others. "Mr. Bennett's here, Joseph." "Solid," pointing toward the dust trail of an approaching rider. "Looks like he's in a hurry." Tom Bennett, now in his 70s but still imposing on horseback, reached them quickly. His expression was grave as he dismounted, a sign that his news wasn't routine. "Telegraph came in from Phoenix," he said without preamble. "Governor wants to meet with you, Jackson. Wants to see the home for himself. He's bringing some federal officials with him, Education Bureau and Indian Affairs." Jackson felt a flicker of alarm. Over the years they had hosted many visitors, including territorial officials, but a visit from the governor, accompanied by federal representatives, suggested something more significant than a routine inspection. "Did the message say why?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite his concern. Bennett shook his head. "Just that they'll arrive next Tuesday, 4 days from now." "That doesn't give us much time to prepare," Jackson mused, his mind already calculating what would need to be done to receive such distinguished visitors. "We don't need to change anything," Joseph said firmly. "Let them see how we really operate, not some special performance put on for officials." The confidence in the young man's voice reminded Jackson how far they had all come from those early, uncertain days. Joseph was right. The strength of what they had built lay in its authenticity, not in superficial impressions designed to please authorities. "You're right," Jackson agreed. "We'll welcome them properly, but we won't pretend to be anything other than what we are." As Bennett rode back to town to send a response to the governor's office, Jackson and Joseph walked down the hill toward the heart of the complex. Children of various ages moved purposefully between buildings, engaged in the daily routines that structured life at the home. Some tended the extensive gardens that provided much of their food, while others cared for livestock or worked at the various crafts taught in the workshops. In the main courtyard, Margaret Callahan, now 23 and serving as the home's educational director, was supervising a group of younger children in what appeared to be a botany lesson, examining plants they had collected from the surrounding countryside. Samuel, 12 now and bursting with the energy that had characterized him since childhood, was demonstrating carpentry techniques to a group of boys his age, his natural talent for teaching evident in his patient explanations and demonstrations. And there was Anna, 11 years old and showing none of the silence that had marked her early childhood. She moved among the smallest children with the natural authority of someone who understood what it meant to need gentle guidance, helping a tearful little boy tie his shoe with the kind of compassionate attention that had become the hallmark of the home's approach. The sight of the 3 Callahan siblings, each contributing their unique gifts to the community that had grown around them, filled Jackson with a pride that went beyond words. They had not merely survived tragedy, they had transformed it into purpose, using their own experiences of loss and recovery to help others find their way through similar darkness. The news of the governor's impending visit spread quickly through the home, generating both excitement and anxiety. While the institution had earned a positive reputation. Everyone understood that official approval remained essential to their continued operation and expansion. In the days leading up to the visit, Jackson met with the staff, mostly local people who had been part of the community effort from the beginning, supplemented by specialists in education and agriculture recruited from farther afield. Together, they prepared to showcase not just the physical facilities, but the philosophy that animated their work. "They'll want to see results," Margaret pointed out during one planning session. "Academic progress, practical skills, health outcomes, all the measurable things that officials care about. We have those," Reverend Carpenter, now serving as the home's chaplain, reminded her. "Our students consistently outperform those in conventional schools, and the older ones have found successful placements in trades, further education, or agricultural positions. But that's not all we are," Jackson insisted. "The measurable outcomes matter, but they're not the heart of what we do. I want these officials to understand that we're not just producing workers or scholars. We're healing wounded hearts and building human beings who know their own worth." The challenge lay in demonstrating something that couldn't be captured in reports or statistics: the transformation that occurred when children who had experienced profound loss found themselves valued not for their utility, but for their inherent humanity. The solution, when it emerged, came from the children themselves. During the evening gathering that had become a tradition at the home, where everyone shared the day's experiences and challenges, 13-year-old Emily Watson, whose parents had died in a flash flood 2 years earlier, offered a suggestion that changed their approach entirely. "Why don't we tell our stories?" she proposed, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had developed during her time at the home. "Not just what we learn or what chores we do, but how we came here and what it means to us. The real story isn't in the buildings or the fields, it's in us." Her suggestion sparked immediate enthusiasm among the other children, and over the next 2 days, they prepared their testimonies with the seriousness of purpose that characterized the home's community. Each child, from the teenagers down to the 6-year-olds, prepared to share some aspect of their journey from loss to belonging. When Tuesday arrived, bringing the governor's party up the long drive to the main buildings, the home was ready, not with polished performances or artificial displays, but with authentic evidence of lives transformed through purposeful care and community. Governor Lawrence Prescott was a political appointee who had risen through territorial politics with ambitions for higher office when Arizona achieved statehood. The federal officials accompanying him represented the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the newly formed Office of Education, agencies with increasing influence over territorial affairs. Jackson greeted them in the main courtyard, flanked by Margaret, Joseph, and Reverend Carpenter. The formalities of introduction completed, he offered a simple overview of the home's history and mission. 7 years ago, 3 orphan children stood on the courthouse steps with no one willing to take them in, he explained. Today, we serve 32 children from across the territory, providing not just shelter and education, but a community where they can heal from loss and discover their potential. "We don't run an orphanage, Governor Prescott. We build family where it's been broken." If the officials were expecting a conventional tour focused on facilities and procedures, they were surprised by what followed. Instead of being led from building to building by administrators, they found themselves guided by the children themselves, each sharing aspects of daily life through their own experiences. Joseph led them through the agricultural operations, explaining how the work wasn't just about producing food, but about learning responsibility and connection to the land. "When I came here, I thought I had nothing left," he told them with the simple eloquence that was his hallmark. "Working with the animals and crops taught me that I could still create, still nurture things, and watch them grow. It healed something in me that I didn't even know was broken." Samuel showed them the workshops where practical skills from carpentry to blacksmithing were taught alongside academic subjects, Mr. Jackson says we need both head and hands, he explained, demonstrating a complex joint he was learning to cut. Some of us will go on to university, others to trades or ranching. But all of us will know how to build something lasting with our own two hands. Anna, with the poise that had replaced her early silence, guided them through the gardens where the youngest children learned their first lessons in responsibility. Even the little ones need to know they can contribute, she said, helping a 5-year-old show how he cared for the plants assigned to him. When you've lost everything, feeling useful again is like finding a piece of yourself you thought was gone forever. Throughout the tour, the children interspersed practical explanations with their personal stories, creating a tapestry of narrative that revealed the true nature of the home's achievement. A 12-year-old whose parents had died of typhoid described how learning to read had given him back his voice. A 9-year-old orphan by mining accident demonstrated the mathematics she was mastering, explaining that numbers made sense when nothing else did. Most powerful were the testimonies of those who had been at the home longest, now approaching adulthood with clear visions for their futures. A 17-year-old who had arrived illiterate at 11 was preparing for entrance exams to a teacher's college. A 16-year-old who had lost both parents to violence was apprenticed to the territorial surveyor, his natural talent for mathematics and mapping recognized and nurtured. By midday, when the entire community gathered for the shared meal that was another home tradition, the officials' initial formality had given way to genuine engagement. Governor Prescott, in particular, seemed moved by what he had witnessed, asking questions that went beyond administrative concerns to the philosophy underlying their approach. Over the simple but abundant meal produced largely from their own fields and gardens, Jackson found himself seated beside the governor, who had abandoned political calculation for sincere curiosity. This is unlike any institution I've seen in 20 years of public service, Prescott admitted. Most orphanages warehouse children until they're old enough for indenture or adoption. You're doing something fundamentally different here. We started with a simple question, Jackson explained. Not how do we manage these children until they're adults, but how do we heal what's been broken in them? The answer turned out to be community, purpose, and the chance to contribute to something larger than themselves. The academic results are impressive, noted Dr. Hamilton, the education official. Your students are achieving at levels that exceed most established schools, despite coming from traumatic backgrounds. Children learn better when they feel safe and valued, Margaret explained. We integrate academic learning with practical application. History isn't just dates in a book. It's understanding how our community came to be. Mathematics isn't abstract. It's calculating lumber for a building or planning crop rotation. The conversation continued through the meal and into the afternoon, expanding to include all aspects of the home's operations, from finances to healthcare, from curriculum to the integration of children from different backgrounds, including several from Native American communities who had lost parents to disease or conflict. As the day drew to a close, Governor Prescott requested a private conversation with Jackson. They walked together toward the hill where Jackson had stood with Joseph just days earlier, looking out over the complex that had grown from such unlikely beginnings. I'm going to be direct, Hargrove, the governor said when they reached the viewpoint. Washington is taking increased interest in how territories manage education and child welfare, particularly with statehood on the horizon. There's pressure to standardize, to bring frontier institutions in line with Eastern models. Jackson felt a flicker of concern. And those models don't include what we're doing here. No, they don't, Prescott agreed. Most official thinking favors large, centralized orphanages and strictly regimented industrial schools, especially for Indian children. The focus is on assimilation and workforce development, not the holistic approach you've developed. The implication was clear: the home's continued operation might be at risk if federal authorities imposed standardized models that contradicted their fundamental philosophy. But, the governor continued, surprising Jackson with a smile. What I've seen here today represents something I believe could change that thinking. Your results speak for themselves, not just in educational outcomes, but in creating young people who are equipped to build the future of this territory. What are you suggesting? Jackson asked cautiously. I'm suggesting that rather than trying to make you conform to existing models, we should be presenting what you've built here as a new model for the entire western frontier. The federal officials with me today are impressed, Hargrove. They see the potential for applying your methods more broadly. The possibility was both exhilarating and intimidating. What had begun as a desperate bid to save 3 children might become a template for institutions throughout the Western territories, potentially affecting thousands of lives. That would require resources beyond what we currently have, Jackson pointed out. And there would be resistance from those invested in conventional approaches. True on both counts, Prescott acknowledged. But I believe it's worth pursuing. I'm prepared to seek federal funding for an expansion of your program, with the condition that you document your methods thoroughly and train others to implement them. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in gold and crimson, Jackson considered the proposition. Expansion would bring challenges, but also opportunities to extend the healing they had witnessed in their own community to children throughout the frontier. I'll need to discuss this with the others, he said finally. This has always been a community effort, not mine alone. The governor nodded his understanding. Of course, but I think you'll find they share your vision. What you've built here is too important to remain small, Hargrove. Some innovations deserve to spread. That evening, after the officials had departed with promises of further discussions, Jackson gathered the home's leadership council, Margaret, Joseph, who had earned his place among the adults through his contributions, Reverend Carpenter, Tom Bennett, and several others who had been part of the journey from the beginning. He shared the governor's proposal, watching their faces as they processed its implications. The opportunity was significant, but so were the potential complications of government partnership and expanded scale. We've always made decisions based on what's best for the children in our care, Margaret reminded them. Would expansion compromise that? Not if we hold firm to our principles, Reverend Carpenter suggested. Documentation doesn't mean dilution. It means articulating what we've learned so others can benefit. Joseph, who had been listening intently, offered the perspective that came from his unique position as both a recipient of the home's care and a contributor to its development. When we first came here, it was about survival, he said thoughtfully. Then it became about healing. Now maybe it's about showing others what's possible. If what happened here could happen in other places, for other children who've lost everything, isn't that worth the risk? His words seemed to resonate with everyone present. The conversation continued late into the night, weighing concerns against opportunities, practical challenges against moral imperatives. By the time they reached consensus, the stars were bright overhead, witnesses to a decision that would extend their influence far beyond what any of them had imagined when they began. 3 days later, Jackson rode to town to send a telegram accepting the governor's proposal, committing the Callahan home and school to becoming a model for a new approach to child welfare across the Western territories. The message was brief, but carried the weight of countless hours of discussion and deliberation by a community determined to honor both its achievements and its aspirations. As he rode back to the home, Jackson found himself thinking about the courthouse auction that had set everything in motion. He had arrived there a desperate man with nothing left to lose, and had left responsible for 3 children he had no idea how to raise. That impulsive act of compassion, born from some deep recognition of shared humanity in the face of loss, had initiated a journey that now promised to transform how an entire region cared for its most vulnerable citizens. The road ahead would not be easy. Expansion would bring new challenges, bureaucratic entanglements, resistance from established interests, the difficulty of maintaining their core values while growing beyond their original scale. But Jackson had learned that the most worthwhile endeavors were rarely simple, and that obstacles often revealed possibilities that might otherwise remain undiscovered. As he crested the final hill before the home came into view, Jackson saw figures waiting for him at the gate: Joseph, Samuel, and Anna, the three children whose placement had cost him his last dollar and given him a purpose beyond anything he could have imagined. They were no longer the frightened, grief-stricken orphans who had arrived at his ranch 7 years earlier, but confident young people with clear visions of their own futures and a deep commitment to helping others find their way through similar darkness. Seeing them, Jackson knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, the foundation they had built together was strong enough to bear the weight of even the most ambitious dreams. What had begun as an act of desperate compassion had become a legacy that would continue long after all of them were gone, a testament to the transformative power of choosing to care when indifference would have been easier, of building family where loss had left only fragments. The setting sun gilded the buildings of the home in golden light as Jackson reached the gate, transforming the simple structures into something that seemed almost magical in its beauty and promise. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new challenges, new opportunities to demonstrate what was possible when a community committed itself to nurturing the potential in every child. But tonight, in this moment of transition between what had been accomplished and what remained to be done, Jackson allowed himself to simply appreciate the journey that had brought them all to this threshold of possibility. "Well?" Joseph asked. As Jackson dismounted, the single word carrying all their shared hopes and concerns about the decision that would shape their future. "We're going forward," Jackson confirmed, his voice steady with conviction. "What we've built here is too important to keep to ourselves." The siblings exchanged glances that contained volumes of shared history and understanding. Then Samuel broke into the wide grin that had become his trademark expression of enthusiasm. "So we're going to change everything?" he asked, excitement brightening his voice. Jackson laughed, the sound carrying across the courtyard where other children were gathering, sensing that important news had arrived. "We already have," he replied, looking around at the community they had created together. "Now we're just going to make sure everyone else has the chance to do the same." As they walked together toward the main building where the evening gathering would soon begin, Jackson reflected that the most profound changes often began with the smallest choices. A bid at an auction, a hand extended to a frightened child, a community coming together to protect its most vulnerable members. From such humble beginnings, movements could arise that transformed not just individual lives, but the very fabric of society itself. The true miracle wasn't in the buildings they had constructed or the programs they had developed, but in the simple recognition that every child deserved to be valued, not for their utility, but for their humanity, not for what they might become, but for who they already were. That recognition, more than any physical legacy, would be their lasting contribution to the territory they called home and the nation it would soon join. Washington, D.C., 1902. The imposing marble corridors of the Capitol building had witnessed countless moments of political theater, but few speeches had commanded the attention now focused on the man addressing the Congressional Committee on Child Welfare and Education. Jackson Hargrove stood before the assembled legislators, his weathered face and calloused hands marking him as someone more accustomed to open skies than government chambers. At 55, his dark hair had given way almost entirely to silver, and the lines etched around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting against the Arizona sun. Yet he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had discovered his purpose and pursued it without wavering. "Gentlemen," he concluded, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence of the frontier despite his careful diction, "what began with 3 orphan children on Courthouse steps has now transformed the lives of Over 2,000 young Americans across 7 states and territories. The Callahan model isn't just an approach to child welfare. It's a recognition that our nation's greatest resource isn't gold or timber or land, but the potential that lives within every child, waiting for the opportunity to flourish. The committee room remained silent for a moment after he finished speaking. Then Senator James Morrison of Massachusetts, the committee chairman, leaned forward with evident interest. "Mr. Hargrove, your results are indeed impressive. The educational outcomes, vocational placements, and community integration rates from your institutions exceed national averages by significant margins. What I find most intriguing, however, is your insistence that these achievements stem not from revolutionary teaching methods or increased funding, but from a fundamentally different conception of the child's place in society." Jackson nodded, grateful for the perceptive observation. "That's precisely right, Senator. Traditional orphanages and industrial schools approach children as problems to be managed or empty vessels to be filled. The Callahan model recognizes that even the most traumatized child arrives with inherent worth and capacity for contribution. Our success stems from creating environments where that worth is recognized and that capacity is developed through meaningful participation in community." Senator Harrison of New York, known for his skepticism toward innovative social programs, frowned slightly. "This all sounds admirable in theory, Hargrove, but the practical implementation must be considerably more complex. How do you maintain standards across multiple institutions while allowing for this individualized approach?" It was a fair question, one that addressed the central challenge they had faced during 12 years of expansion. Jackson was about to respond when the committee room door opened, admitting a latecomer whose arrival caused a ripple of interest among the assembled legislators. President Theodore Roosevelt, known for his unexpected appearances at committee hearings that captured his interest, nodded to Senator Morrison and took a seat at the back of the room. His presence immediately elevated the significance of the proceedings, confirming rumors that the administration was seriously considering the nationwide implementation of the Callahan model as part of its progressive reforms. Jackson acknowledged the president with a respectful nod before turning back to Senator Harrison's question. "You've identified the exact tension we navigate daily, Senator. The key lies in distinguishing between non-negotiable core principles and flexible implementation methods. Every Callahan home adheres to the same fundamental philosophy that children heal and develop best in family-structured communities where they contribute meaningfully and are valued inherently. How that philosophy manifests in Prescott, Arizona, might look different from its expression in Boise, Idaho, but the underlying principles remain consistent." The discussion continued for another hour, with Jackson fielding questions about funding mechanisms, staff training, educational curricula, and the particular challenges of serving indigenous children and immigrant populations. Throughout, he demonstrated the practical wisdom of someone who had built his understanding through direct experience rather than abstract theory. What he didn't share, what couldn't be captured in statistics or policy proposals, was the personal journey that had brought him to this moment. The legislators saw an accomplished administrator presenting a successful program for national consideration. They couldn't see the desperate rancher who had spent his last dollar on 3 orphan children, or the community that had rallied around an improbable family forged from shared loss. As the hearing concluded and the committee members filed out, President Roosevelt approached Jackson with characteristic directness. "Walk with me, Hargrove," he said, less a request than a command. "I want to hear more about this model of yours." Without the formal constraints of the committee room, they moved through the Capitol corridors, an unlikely pair, the energetic president with his pince-nez and broad smile, alongside the weathered frontiersman whose quiet strength seemed at odds with the marble grandeur surrounding them. "What these legislators don't yet grasp," Roosevelt said without preamble, is that your work represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking this nation needs as we enter a new century. The frontier that shaped American character is closing, Hargrove. We must find new ways to develop the qualities of self-reliance, community responsibility, and purposeful living that the frontier naturally cultivated. Jackson considered this perspective thoughtfully. I hadn't framed our work in those terms, Mr. President, but there's truth in what you say. The children in our care learn the same lessons I learned growing up on a frontier ranch, that their contributions matter, that community survival depends on mutual support, that meaning comes from building something larger than oneself. Roosevelt nodded vigorously. Precisely. And that's what makes your approach so valuable beyond the immediate concern of orphan children. You're preserving essential aspects of American character that might otherwise be lost in our rush toward urbanization and industrialization. They reached the Capitol steps, pausing in the crisp autumn air. Below them, Washington spread out in ordered magnificence, so different from the rugged beauty of the Arizona landscape where Jackson had built his life's work. My administration is prepared to fully support the national implementation of the Callahan model, Roosevelt stated, his decisive tone making clear this was no casual endorsement. The necessary legislation will be introduced next month, with funding appropriations sufficient for establishment of training centers and model homes in every state and territory. The scale of the commitment took Jackson's breath away. What had begun with 3 children on Courthouse steps would now touch lives across an entire nation. There's one condition, however, Roosevelt continued, fixing Jackson with his penetrating gaze. We need you in Washington, Hargrove. Not permanently, I understand your heart remains in Arizona, but regularly enough to oversee implementation and train those who will carry this work forward. Your practical experience is irreplaceable. The request presented Jackson with a dilemma he hadn't anticipated. His life's work was in Arizona, not just in the institutions he had helped establish, but in the family that had grown around him. The original Callahan siblings were adults, now Joseph 26, and managing agricultural operations across 3 states. Samuel 22, and completing advanced studies in engineering at the Territorial University. Anna 21, and directing educational programs at the original home. Yet Roosevelt's proposal offered the opportunity to extend their model's influence far beyond what they had imagined possible, potentially transforming the lives of tens of thousands of children who would otherwise be lost in institutions that valued compliance over healing, utility over humanity. I'll need to consult with my family and colleagues, Jackson said finally. This isn't a decision I can make alone. Roosevelt's smile suggested he had expected nothing less. Of course. The strength of your model lies in its collaborative nature. Take whatever time you need, though not too much, huh? There are children waiting who need what you've built. That evening, Jackson sent a telegram to the Callahan home, requesting an urgent family council upon his return. The cryptic message couldn't convey the magnitude of Roosevelt's proposal or the personal implications it carried, but it would prepare them for a decision that would shape the next chapter of their shared journey. 2 weeks later, Jackson stepped off the train in Prescott, breathing deeply of the desert air that still felt like home despite his extensive travels. Joseph was waiting with the wagon, his tall frame and quiet confidence a constant reminder of how far they had all come from. That courthouse auction 19 years earlier. How was Washington? Joseph asked as they loaded Jackson's modest luggage. Grand, overwhelming, full of people who talk a great deal and listen very little, Jackson replied with a small smile. Though I did meet some who genuinely want to improve children's lives, including the president himself. Joseph whistled softly. Roosevelt? No wonder you called for a family council. The 5-mile journey to the Callahan home passed in comfortable conversation about local developments, the progress of the autumn harvest, a new irrigation system Samuel had designed before returning to university, the engagement of one of their earliest residence to the territorial surveyor's daughter. As they crested the final hill, the home spread before them in the afternoon light, a complex of buildings arranged around open courtyards, surrounded by fields and orchards that provided both sustenance and practical education. Children of various ages moved purposefully through the grounds, engaged in the work and learning that structured their days. What had begun as a desperate improvisation on a failing ranch had become a thriving community that combined the best aspects of school, farm, and family. More importantly, it had become a model replicated in 14 locations across the western states and territories, each maintaining the core philosophy while adapting to local conditions and needs. That evening, after the younger children had gone to bed, Jackson gathered with the original Callahan, siblings and key staff in the library that had been added to the main building during one of the many expansions. Margaret, now 35, and serving as overall director of the home, had arranged comfortable seating in a circle, their traditional configuration for important discussions. Anna arrived last, having stayed to comfort a newly arrived 7-year-old struggling with nightmares. Her gentle patience with traumatized children stemmed from vivid memories of her own early fears and the security she had found in Jackson's steady presence. "Everyone's here," Margaret said, closing the door. "What's this urgent matter from Washington, Jackson?" He shared Roosevelt's proposal in detail, including the president's request for his personal involvement in the national implementation. As he spoke, he watched their faces, reading the complex emotions his news evoked: pride in their model's recognition, excitement about its expanded influence, concern about the practical challenges of national scale, and wariness about changes to their own community. When he finished, the room fell silent as each person processed the implications. It was Samuel who spoke first, his engineer's mind already analyzing the structural requirements. "We'd need to develop standardized training protocols while allowing for regional adaptation," he mused, "and quality control mechanisms to ensure the core philosophy isn't lost in implementation. The financial support would allow us to reach children we've had to turn away," Margaret added. "Just last month, I received letters from officials in 3 counties asking if we could establish homes in their regions." Joseph remained quiet, his thoughtful expression revealing he was considering deeper implications. Finally, he looked directly at Jackson. "This isn't just about the model, is it? It's about you, about what Roosevelt is asking of you personally." The observation cut to the heart of Jackson's ambivalence. At 55, he had expected to gradually reduce his administrative responsibilities, focusing more on mentoring the next generation of leaders who would carry their work forward. The president's proposal would instead thrust him into years of intensive national work, just when he had been contemplating a step back. "Roosevelt wants me in Washington regularly," he confirmed. "Not permanently, but enough to oversee implementation and train regional directors." "You've earned the right to decline," Anna said softly. "You've already given more than anyone could have asked." Her words touched Jackson deeply. These 4 individuals, Margaret, Joseph, Samuel, and Anna, had been his family for nearly 2 decades. Though none carried his name legally, they were his children in every way that mattered. Their growth into capable, compassionate adults represented his true legacy, more significant than any institution or national program. "What would you do?" he asked them, genuinely uncertain about the right path forward. "If the decision were yours?" The question sparked an hours-long discussion that ranged far beyond the immediate proposal to the fundamental question of how they defined success. Was it measured in the depth of impact on those directly under their care, or in the breadth of influence across the nation? Was their responsibility primarily to their local community, or did it extend to thousands of children they would never meet personally? As midnight approached, Margaret summarized the consensus that had gradually emerged. "The opportunity is too significant to decline," she said. "What we've built here has always been meant as a model for others, not a sanctuary for ourselves. But implementation matters as much as philosophy. If the Callahan model is to truly transform national practice, it needs someone who embodies its principles guiding the process. Joseph nodded agreement. Which means you should accept Roosevelt's request, but with conditions that protect both the integrity of the model and your own well-being. By dawn, they had crafted a response that accepted the president's proposal while establishing clear parameters. Jackson would serve as National Director of Implementation for 3 years, dividing his time between Washington and regional centers. The original home would become the primary training facility for the national program, with Margaret, Joseph, and Anna taking expanded leadership roles. Most importantly, they would develop a cohort of regional directors drawn from those who had experienced the Callahan model firsthand, former residents who had grown up in their care and now wished to extend its benefits to others. The true test of what we've built, Jackson observed as they concluded their planning, isn't whether it works while we're here to guide it, but whether it can be faithfully reproduced by those who come after us. 3 days later, Jackson sent his response to the White House. Roosevelt's enthusiastic acceptance arrived by telegraph the same day, with a request for Jackson to return to Washington within the month to begin the detailed planning that would transform their local innovation into national policy. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation, documenting procedures, selecting initial training candidates, restructuring local responsibilities to accommodate Jackson's reduced presence. Through it all, he found himself increasingly reflective, measuring the distance between the desperate rancher who had bid on 3 orphan children and the man now entrusted with reshaping how an entire nation cared for its most vulnerable citizens. The morning of his departure dawned clear and cool, with the scent of sage carried on the breeze that rustled through the cottonwoods surrounding the home. Jackson rose before sunrise, drawn to the hill that offered the best view of all they had built together. He stood in the growing light, watching as the complex below came to life with the day's first activities. Kitchen smoke rose from chimneys. Older children moved toward the barns for morning chores, and staff prepared for the day's lessons and projects. The scene radiated the ordered purpose that had become the hallmark of their approach, not the rigid regimentation of institutional life, but the natural rhythm of a community where everyone's contribution mattered. Footsteps behind him announced Joseph's arrival. The young man joined him in silence, both of them watching the community awakening below. "I remember the first morning at your ranch," Joseph said finally. "I was terrified, but trying not to show it, desperate to prove I was worth keeping. You asked if I could help with chores, and I felt important, needed. It was the first time since losing our parents that I felt I still had something to offer." Jackson nodded, recalling the solemn 7-year-old who had tried so hard to be useful. "You were a remarkable child." "All of you were. It wasn't just us," Joseph replied. "It was what you created around us, a place where we mattered not because of what we could do, but because of who we were. That's what every child at every Callahan home experiences now. And it's what thousands more will experience when the national program begins." They fell silent again, watching as Samuel emerged from the main building, gesturing animatedly to a group of teenage boys who were constructing a new irrigation system based on his designs. Even from a distance, his enthusiasm was visible in every movement, his natural teaching ability evident in how the boys responded to his guidance. Near the kitchen gardens, Anna knelt beside a young girl recently arrived from a mining town where influenza had claimed her entire family. Whatever Anna was saying made the child nod seriously, then smile for what might have been the first time since her arrival. It was the kind of moment that occurred daily at the home, small interactions that began the healing process for wounded hearts. "We'll be fine while you're in Washington," Joseph said, accurately reading Jackson's thoughts. "What you built isn't dependent on your daily presence anymore. It lives in all of us, in how we approach each child who comes through our gates." Jackson felt a swell of emotion that nearly overwhelmed his customary reserve. "I never expected any of this," he admitted. "That day at the auction, I was just trying to keep 3 children from being separated. I had no vision beyond that moment." "Sometimes the smallest choices have the largest consequences," Joseph observed. "You taught us that. One decision, made from compassion rather than calculation, can set in motion changes that transform not just individual lives, but entire systems." The sun had fully cleared the eastern mountains now, illuminating the valley in golden light. That transformed the simple buildings into something almost magical. Below them, the daily gathering bell rang, summoning everyone to the morning meal that would begin, as always, with each person sharing one hope for the day ahead. "It's time," Joseph said. "Everyone's waiting to see you off." As they walked down the hill toward the community that had grown from such unlikely beginnings, Jackson reflected on the journey ahead. There would be challenges in Washington bureaucratic obstacles, resistance from established interests, the natural inertia of large systems resistant to change. The task of transforming national policy would demand every ounce of the practical wisdom and patient persistence he had developed over 2 decades of building the Callahan model, yet he approached this new chapter with the same quiet determination that had characterized every phase of their remarkable journey. The desperate bid at a courthouse auction had given him not just a family, but a purpose that extended beyond anything he could have imagined. When he placed those $17.43 on the auction block, the community gathered. In the main courtyard, children, staff, and local supporters assembled to bid him farewell on his journey to the nation's capital. As Jackson moved among them, accepting good wishes and promises of prayers, he was struck by how many lives had become intertwined with his own through this shared mission. Some faces belonged to the first generation of children who had found healing at the home, now returned as staff or community supporters. Others were more recent arrivals, still carrying the shadows of loss, but beginning to show the first signs of the resilience that would eventually transform their trauma into purpose. Together, they represented both the achievement of the past and the promise of the future living, testimony to the power of compassionate innovation to heal what had been broken. Margaret stepped forward as the gathering concluded, presenting Jackson with a leather portfolio crafted by the Home's workshop. "For your presentations in Washington," she explained. "It contains letters from every child and staff member, sharing how the Callahan model has influenced their lives. When you speak to officials who see only statistics and budgets, these stories will remind them that policies affect real children with names and dreams and infinite potential." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Jackson deeply. In the formal chambers of Washington, surrounded by legislators concerned with efficiency and measurable outcomes, these personal testimonies would anchor him to the human reality at the heart of their work. As the wagon that would take him to the train station was prepared, Jackson found himself surrounded one last time by the 4 individuals who had been the beginning of everything: Margaret, Joseph, Samuel, and Anna. Though none shared his blood, they were bound by ties stronger than genetics, the shared journey from trauma to healing, from isolation to community, from desperation to purpose. "Remember why we do this," Margaret said, embracing him with the confidence of a woman who had found her calling in continuing what he had begun. "Not for recognition or expansion, but for each child who needs to know they still matter even when they've lost everything. Bring back ideas for improvements," Samuel added with his characteristic focus on innovation. "Washington may have resources, but we have practical experience. The exchange should benefit both." Joseph simply gripped his hand firmly. "We'll be here when you return. The home is in good hands." It was Anna, the once silent 3-year-old who had placed her tiny hand in his on that first wagon ride to the ranch, who offered the words that would sustain him through the challenges ahead. "You taught us that family isn't about where you're "Born but where you belong," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears despite her smile. "You've given that gift to hundreds of children already. Now thousands more will receive it because of what begins today." As the wagon pulled away, Jackson looked back at the community standing together in the morning. Sunlight, children, and adults united by a shared vision that had grown from the simplest of human instincts, the unwillingness to see suffering without. Responding, the recognition that every child deserves to be valued not for their utility, but for their inherent worth. What had begun with a desperate bid at a courthouse auction had become a movement that would transform how an entire nation understood its responsibility to its most vulnerable citizens. The legacy would extend far beyond buildings or programs, or policies, living on in the lives of countless children who would discover their own worth and potential through the approach that now bore the Callahan name. As the home disappeared from view around a bend in the road, Jackson turned his face toward the journey ahead, carrying with him not just the leather portfolio of testimonies, but the absolute certainty that even the most improbable beginnings could lead to transformations beyond imagination when guided by compassion, sustained by community, and dedicated to recognizing the infinite value of every human life. The Callahan model would soon belong to the nation, but its heart would always remain in the Arizona Territory, where a failing rancher had spent his last dollar to save 3 orphan children, and in so doing had found not just a family but a purpose that would echo through generations yet unborn. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.